What if Star Citizen is finally getting the kind of fleet gameplay it's been missing for years? Not just bigger ship fights or more enemies on screen. I'm talking about an actual layered space operation where different ships have different jobs, and the mission only works if those roles come together the way they're supposed to. That's why tactical strike groups immediately stood out to me. Because if CIG pulls this off, this could be the clearest look yet at what spaceborne combined arms in Star Citizen is actually meant to feel like. And honestly, that matters, because for a long time, Star Citizen has had a lot of combat ships, a lot of multi-crew ships, and a lot of ideas about larger operations. But it hasn't had enough mission structure that actually gives all of those things a real purpose. Tactical strike groups might finally start changing that, or at least that's my hope. So join me as we take a look at how it could shape the future of multi-crew gameplay. Based on what CIG described, this isn't just another combat mission. It's a full-scale operation. A People's Alliance capital ship investigates a station, gets overwhelmed, and members of the team are taken hostage. You're called in to help recover them, but the station isn't something you can overwhelm with sheer numbers. First, fighters have to deal with enemy waves outside the station. Then there are shielded power relays that can't just be burned down with the usual energy loadouts. Those primarily need explosive or ballistic ordnance, which means strike craft and bombers actually have a defined role. After that, the station opens up, and you fly inside the structure itself to hit cooling units in a trench run style attack. Once those go down, the core becomes vulnerable. The anti-capital defenses collapse, and only then can ships like the Polaris or Idris move in safely and start doing what they're supposed to do. And that's before the operation shifts again into rearming and refueling, an FPS assault, hostage extraction, and eventually a Vandal escalation. That's a lot, but that's also exactly why this is exciting. For a while, one of Star Citizen's biggest combat problems has been role separation. A skilled enough pilot in the right fighter could often threaten almost anything if they had enough time. Fighters weren't just fighting other fighters. They could chip away at ships far above their weight class, stay mostly untouchable, and eventually win fights they probably shouldn't have been winning in the first place. Tactical strike groups sounds different because it's being built around the opposite idea. Not every ship should be able to handle every problem, and not every pilot should be able to dominate the whole fight alone. Fighters, bombers, support ships, and capital ships will all have their own roles. And that's what Star Citizen has needed more of for a very long time. Now, with that said, just because the mission concept is strong doesn't mean the surrounding gameplay is fully ready for it. In fact, I think tactical strike groups could end up exposing several of the biggest weaknesses Star Citizen still has when it comes to multi-crew and fleet operations. The first one is turret gameplay. If this kind of content is supposed to push people toward larger ships and more crewed ships, then turret seats have to matter. They can't feel like backup positions that exist just to fill space. If ships like the Idris are going to depend more on the people around the pilot, then those stations need to feel dangerous, responsive, and worth manning. Right now, turrets still don't consistently feel that way. They need better accuracy, better tracking, and honestly, better overall presence in a fight. Because if being a gunner doesn't feel impactful, then larger ships won't feel better to crew. They'll just feel harder to justify. That's a huge problem because tactical strike groups sound like the kind of content that should finally make larger fleet ships feel useful in the way they were always supposed to. But that only works if the people in those seats are shaping the fight in a meaningful way. The second issue is engineering. If Star Citizen wants longer operations with ships acting like actual warships, then engineering can't feel like a system that occasionally pops up in the background. And right now, it just doesn't feel like it's there yet. Fires and component failures don't feel common enough. Emergency response inside the ship doesn't feel like something crews are regularly dealing with in a way that changes the tempo of the fight. And on top of that, we still don't have enough things like misfires and malfunctions, forcing crews to react to ship systems breaking down under pressure. That matters, because a mission like Tactical Strike Groups isn't describing a quick skirmish. It's describing a sustained operation. Multiple phases, multiple threats, resource consumption, and repeated exposure to combat. In that kind of environment, engineering should be one of the things that makes larger ships interesting. It should feel like your crew is keeping the ship alive under stress, not just waiting around for a rare fire to maybe happen once in a while. Now, if you're enjoying this kind of deeper Star Citizen breakdown, subscribe to the channel. That's what I focus on here. Clear, thoughtful coverage on where the game is heading, what CIG is getting right, what still needs work, and all of what it could mean for the future of the project. The next issue is probably the biggest one underneath everything else. Multi-crew has to have a clear purpose. And that question matters even more now as larger ships become more dependent on dedicated crew roles. And to be fair, Tactical Strike Groups looks like one of the first mission concepts that could actually finally help with that. The structure itself creates reasons to bring different classes of ships. Fighters clear threats, strike craft handle hardened objectives. Agile ships do the trench work. Capital ships become forward support and staging platforms. And boarding teams finish the interior objective. That's good design, but the game still has to prove that fully crewing a ship is actually worth it. Because the real question isn't whether multi-crew ships can participate. It's whether it becomes meaningfully better when it has the right people on board. It should feel more survivable, more effective, and more useful to the fleet around it throughout the fight. If that payoff isn't there, players will always drift back toward simpler and more efficient options. And that leads straight into another major issue: social tools. A mission like Tactical Strike Groups assumes players can quickly build a team, assign roles, split up responsibilities, figure out who's flying what, who's boarding, who's supporting, and who's doing the trench run, all without turning the pre-mission setup into a mess. Right now, Star Citizen still isn't strong enough there. Now, that doesn't mean players can't organize through Discord or within established groups. Obviously, they can. But if this kind of content is meant to become a real part of the live game, then the game itself needs better tools to support it. Better grouping, clearer role assignment, easier organization, and less friction when it comes to building an actual operation. Because if the mission depends on coordination, the game needs to help players coordinate. Another thing Tactical Strike Groups could expose is whether CIG is finally serious about breaking away from the old pattern where one skilled pilot, one flexible ship, and enough time could solve almost any combat problem. This mission sounds promising because it's clearly designed to stop one ship or one pilot from solving everything. You can't just bring the biggest ship and win. You can't just take one dominant loadout and brute force every phase. And ideally, you shouldn't be able to sit at max range and slowly wear down something far above your weight class either. There are specific problems here, and those problems appear to require specific answers. That's the right direction, but it can't stop here. If Tactical Strike Groups does this well, but the rest of the game still defaults back to one dominant meta answer, then this ends up feeling more like a special event than a real shift in philosophy. For this to matter long-term, Star Citizen still needs more combat content that keeps reinforcing the same idea. Ship choices should matter. Crew roles should matter. And the best answer shouldn't always be the same thing. Now, there is one concern here that I do think is worth acknowledging, and that's the risk of this feeling too much like a raid or dungeon. Because when you hear about more structured phases, layered objectives, and a more curated operation, some players are naturally going to worry that Star Citizen is moving too far toward a traditional MMO-style mission format. Now, I get that concern, but honestly, I think the bigger issue for Star Citizen has been the opposite. For years, it hasn't had enough structured combat content that actually gives different ships and roles a reason to exist together in the same mission. And I mean that in all forms, whether it's a sandbox activity or a structured instanced operation. So for me, the question isn't whether tactical strike groups are too structured. The question is whether it still feels like it belongs naturally within Star Citizen's universe. If it does, then this could be one of the best things that they've added to ship combat in a long time. Finally, there's the technical side, and I don't mean in that lazy server performance is bad kind of way. I mean it in the sense that tactical strike groups is a very heavy concept. There's ship combat outside of the station, a trench run style attack, capital ship staging, refuel and rearm support, FPS assault, extraction, AI escalation, and Vandal pressure on top of that. That's a lot of moving parts. So if this feature is going to work consistently, I do think this is one of the clearest examples of where instancing, or at least more controlled mission spaces, could become part of the solution. Not because instancing magically fixes everything, but because content this layered needs enough stability to preserve pacing, readability, and role execution. If the entire thing turns into desync, chaos, and broken transitions, the mission will fall apart quickly and be less enjoyable. So overall, I think tactical strike groups could be one of the most important combat additions Star Citizen has had in years. Not because it instantly solves fleet gameplay, but because it finally looks like a mission built around the idea that fleet gameplay should exist in the first place. And I think that's the real promise here. There's a chance for Star Citizen to show players what spaceborne combined arms is supposed to feel like when fighters, strike ships, capital ships, and boarding teams all have distinct jobs inside one operation. And when larger ships finally feel built around crews instead of just scale. But for that promise to really land, turret gameplay has to get stronger. Engineering has to become deeper. Multi-crew ships need real purpose. Social tools need to catch up. And technically, the game needs to support something this layered without it falling apart under its own weight. But what do you think? Does tactical strike groups sound like the kind of combat content Star Citizen has needed for years? Or are you worried it could end up feeling too curated, too instance-driven, or just not ready for the current state of the game? Let me know down in the comments. I'd really like to hear where you stand on this one. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and share it with somebody who's been waiting for proper fleet gameplay and help push the conversation forward. If you want to support the channel a bit more directly, consider becoming a channel member. It really does help me keep making these videos, and members get access to exclusive Discord channels, recognition in every video, and early access to certain content. And if you want to hear more about how 4.7's recent armor changes could reshape combat, go check out my recent video on that next. As always, thanks for watching. Fly safe, pilots, and I'll see you in the verse. Havoc out.